3 men offered her work that afternoon. One wanted her body. One wanted her hands ruined. One wanted her silence. She turned them all down. With nothing but 38 cents in her pocket and a pair of surgical scissors sharp enough to cut through a man's vest, Clara Brennan rode 2 days on a train to marry a man who never showed up. Instead, she found a 2-line letter that destroyed everything she'd planned. No money, no husband, no way home. Just a dusty frontier town that swallowed women whole. But then a stranger asked her one question, the only question that mattered. And that question changed everything. It led her to a dying ranch, 3 wounded men, a sealed whiskey bottle that told a love story without words, and a secret that connected the man she ran from to the man she was starting to trust. What she didn't know, someone in that town wanted her gone, and they knew the one thing from her past that could destroy her. Welcome to Wild West Stories channel, where the dust of the frontier carries tales of fearless love, unbreakable bonds, and the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to give up on each other. This story will remind you that the life you planned falling apart might be the only way to find the life you were meant to live, and that real strength isn't carrying the weight alone, it's letting someone share it with you. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, drop a comment telling us your favorite moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story from the wild, beautiful West. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience.
3 men offered Clara Brennan work that afternoon in Prospect. All 3 assumed she had no choice. None of them knew that her refusal would make one of them want her dead. The train had pulled out of Prospect 40 minutes ago, belching black smoke and grinding iron against iron, until the sound faded east and left nothing but wind. Clara stood on the depot platform with her carpet bag in one hand and Thomas Whitfield's letter in the other. 2 lines of ink smeared now from handling. She had read it so many times during the 2-day journey from Philadelphia that the words had worn thin at the creases, but they had not gotten any easier to swallow. Cannot go through with it. You will understand someday. 2 lines. 2 days on a train. 38 cents in her coin purse and a trunk full of wedding dress she had sewn herself. 40 yards of ivory silk with seed pearls at the collar. The platform had emptied an hour ago. Families reunited, wagons rolling away. A woman in a blue bonnet had wept against her husband's chest. A boy had been lifted onto his father's shoulders. Everyone had somewhere to go and someone waiting for them. Everyone except Clara. She stepped off the platform and crossed the dirt street toward the Western Union office. The town of Prospect sprawled in afternoon glare, false front buildings baking in the sun, freight wagons churning dust, men in wide-brimmed hats moving past like they had somewhere to be. The smell of horse manure mixed with sage and sun-baked wood. A blacksmith's hammer clanged 2 streets over, rhythmic and sharp. The mountains rose purple in the distance, and the sky stretched so wide it made Clara's chest ache. Inside the Western Union office, she pressed her palm flat against the counter. 3 telegram forms, 3 drafts to her father in Philadelphia. The first said she had arrived safely and the wedding was next week. The second said Thomas had been delayed, but everything was fine. The third said, please send money. Something has gone wrong. Each one a different lie she could not make herself tell. She crumpled all 3 and left them on the counter. Back outside, the sun pressed down like a hand on her shoulders. Her throat was dust dry. She had not drunk water since Kansas City, maybe. Stale bread that sat like a stone. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and something worse than hunger. Big Jack McGraw blocked the boarding house steps. He had shoulders like a draft horse, a beard stained yellow at the mustache with tobacco juice, and the smell of whiskey hit Clara before his words did, sweet and sour coating the back of her throat. You are that girl, he said, waiting for someone. Not a question. His eyes tracked down to her collar. Back up, down again. Got refined manners, he said. Eastern schooling, I would wager. Clara shifted the carpet bag to her other hand. The leather handle had worn a groove across her palm during the 2-day journey, and the groove throbbed now. Could use a girl like you at the Silver Dollar, McGraw said. He stepped closer. Not touching, just close enough that her back hit the railing. Pouring drinks upstairs for the poker games. Real gentle-like, $2 a night. His breath moved the loose hair at her temple. Clara's right hand slipped into her medical satchel. Her fingers found the Sheffield surgical scissors, 6 inches of English steel, sharp enough to cut through muscle. She brought them out smooth, caught the sunlight on the blade, and nicked the lapel of McGraw's vest. A clean, deliberate cut through the fabric. The thread parted with a soft sound. McGraw stepped back, more from surprise than fear. He looked down at the cut in his vest, then back up at Clara. His eyes went hard and flat like stones at the bottom of a river. Clara held the scissors steady. "No, thank you," she said. McGraw's jaw worked. He stepped aside, but his eyes followed her all the way down the steps. She could feel them on her back like a brand. He would remember that cut. Clara knew it. She did not care. The laundry shed behind the hotel belched steam into the afternoon heat. Mrs. Lundgren stood over a copper tub, stirring sheets with a wooden paddle. She was a Swedish woman, broad-shouldered and silent, and her hands were swollen red. The skin had cracked and was bleeding around the fingernails. 50 cents a day, 6 days, dawn to dark. Clara watched those ruined hands push and lift and wring. She thought about saying yes. She thought about taking the paddle and standing over that tub until her own hands looked the same. Then Mrs. Lundgren followed her to the door and whispered something that stopped Clara in her tracks. "Do not stay here, girl. This town swallows women." Clara walked away. The Fletcher mansion squatted on the hill above town. 3 stories, gingerbread trim. A maid in black who led Clara to the parlor. Mrs. Fletcher reclined on a horsehair sofa, a cameo brooch the size of a silver dollar at her throat. She explained that Mr. Fletcher appreciated a household that ran smoothly. "Very appreciative," she said, "if you take my meaning." Clara stood. The chair scraped loud on the polished floor. On her way out, she passed a family photograph on the hall table. 3 small children, scrubbed and solemn, staring at the camera with eyes that knew too much. Mrs. Fletcher was not evil. She was a woman who had surrendered. The detail was small, but it sat heavy in Clara's chest as she walked back down the hill. The dry goods store had a bench out front. Clara sat, opened her coin purse, counted 38 cents, enough for maybe 2 more nights at the boarding house if she did not eat. Her throat was dust dry and her hands were shaking, and she was alone in a town where nobody knew her name, and the man who was supposed to be her husband had vanished like smoke. That was when she noticed the cowboy. He leaned against a post across the street. He had been there when she went into the saloon, still there when she came out of the laundry shed, still there now, watching, not staring, just watching, the way a man watches weather coming over the mountains. Bootsteps crossed the street. Clara's shoulders pulled back. Her hand found the scissors again. But it was not Big Jack McGraw. It was the man from the post, 40 or so, face weathered like old leather left in the rain. Faded denim shirt dark with sweat under the arms. His Stetson had a salt ring around the crown. When he pulled it off, his hair stuck up funny on one side. "Was not trying to be strange," he said. He turned the hat brim in his hands. "Been watching you all afternoon. I mean, just seems like you turned down 3 jobs. Clara's jaw set. "You were counting." "Hard not to notice," he said, "when a woman walks into 3 places and comes out looking like she would rather starve." He shifted his weight to his other boot. The movement pulled his sleeve up, and Clara saw the scar. It ran from wrist to elbow, thick and ropey and white with age. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he asked. And Clara, exhausted down to her bones, furious at Thomas and herself and this whole godforsaken town, told the truth. "I am a nurse, trained at Pennsylvania Hospital for 3 years. I came west to marry, but that did not work out. I am good at what I do, but I do not want to pour drinks for drunks or scrub rich women's floors or smile at men who think their money buys more than labor. The cowboy watched her face long enough that heat climbed her neck. You afraid of hard work? He asked. His voice was rough, like he did not use it much. No. You mind isolation. 2 hours from town. No neighbors close. No. You squeamish. Clara opened her medical satchel and showed him what was inside. Brown bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid, rolled bandages, surgical scissors, obstetric forceps that had belonged to her mother, 3 scalpels in a felt-lined case. I have assisted in amputations, she said. Delivered breech babies, held intestines in place while a surgeon sutured perforations, set compound fractures. She closed the satchel with a snap. Number 1. I am not squeamish. His mouth quirked. Not quite a smile. Name is Jacob Cole, he said. I got a ranch north of here. 3 men hurt bad. Town doctor will not come. Says it is too far for what I can pay. These men stayed with me when my wife was sick. Worked for promises instead of wages. I am not letting them die because they are poor. Clara studied him. The scar, the tired eyes, the way he held his hat like he was not sure what to do with his hands. What are you offering me, she asked. A room. Nothing fancy. Cannot pay wages. Ranch is running on credit. But there are folks out there who need help. Homesteaders, small ranchers, you could treat them, trade for what you need. So I would be living on your property alone with you and 3 injured men I have never met, Clara said flatly. In the middle of nowhere. Jacob looked at her directly. Yes, ma'am. That is the situation. And if you do not like it, I will bring you back to town by sundown. Clara looked at her hands. The groove from the carpet bag handle had left a red welt across her palm. These hands had delivered 11 babies and set 23 broken bones. These hands knew their work. I will need to see them before I decide, she said. Jacob nodded once. Fair enough. Let me get my wagon. He walked toward the livery. Clara watched him go, his gait slightly uneven, favoring his left leg. An old injury, healed but not forgotten. She climbed up onto the buckboard before she could change her mind. Jacob loaded her trunk and her carpet bag and her medical satchel. A Winchester rifle stood in a boot near the seat. Clara's breath caught. For coyotes, Jacob said. Just coyotes. The wagon rolled north. Prospect shrank behind them. Buildings going small, then smaller, then gone. Jacob Cole did not know that the woman he had just invited to his ranch was being hunted by the same man he owed money to. And Clara Brennan did not know that the 2-line letter in her pocket had been written at Harlan Briggs's desk. The first thing Clara smelled when she stepped into the bunkhouse was not rot. It was gangrene. She knew that smell. She had last encountered it in Philadelphia, the night Helen Morris bled to death on the delivery table. The 2-hour ride north had changed the land around them. Trees thinned out, cottonwoods first, then aspens, then just scattered juniper clinging to rocky ground. Prairie grass stretched knee-high on both sides, gold in the evening light. The wagon wheels cut through it, leaving twin tracks that closed up behind them like water. Jacob did not talk, just drove. Hands loose on the reins, eyes on the horizon. The rangy gelding pulling the wagon had a steady gait. No hurry, no hesitation. Clara's backside went numb on the hard bench. She shifted. The wood creaked. Splinters caught in her skirt. Through Jacob's eyes, the woman beside him was a practical solution to a desperate problem. 3 men dead meant he could not work the ranch alone. Could not work the ranch alone meant he would default on the debt he owed Harlan Briggs. Defaulting meant losing the land. Clara Brennan was not a charity case. She was a calculation. Jacob hated himself for thinking that way. But he had learned a long time ago that sentiment did not keep cattle alive or creditors at bay. He glanced at her. The way she held her chin up even when her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. The way her jaw set when she was thinking. He had seen that look before. Sarah used to look exactly that way when she was deciding something and did not want anyone to know she was scared. The recognition hit him like a fist under the ribs. The ranch appeared gradual. First a fence line, wire strung between weathered posts, some sagging where animals had pushed through. Then the barn, gray and listing slightly to the left, roof patched with different colored shingles. Then the house, unpainted clapboard, single story. Shutters hung straight but needed paint. Sarah's rocking chair still sat on the porch, the wood gone gray, the seat rotting through. Jacob had not moved it in 2 years. He could not bring himself to touch it, and could not explain why. The whole place was a portrait of grief frozen in time. Weeds growing through the front walk, porch steps warped, one board missing, a vegetable garden struggling near the back, tomato plants stunted on their stakes. 6 horses stood in the corral, heads lifting as the wagon approached. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop, set the brake, climbed down without offering to help Clara. She climbed down herself. Her legs shook when her boots hit ground. "Bunkhouse is there," Jacob said, pointing to a low building behind the barn. Chinked logs with mud stuffed between them, single window, dark inside. Clara said, "I need to see my room first." He led her to the house. The door stuck. He shouldered it open. Inside, a kitchen and main room combined. Cast iron stove, scrubbed pine table, 2 chairs. Her room was small, rope bed against one wall, straw ticking covered with a thin blanket, washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, one window with a gingham curtain faded almost white. "Window faces east," Jacob said. "You get morning light." Clara set her carpet bag on the bed. "Thank you." Then she picked up her medical satchel and walked out. The bunkhouse door scraped open against warped wood. The smell hit her full force. Sweat, old and fresh, leather, hay, and underneath, that sour, sweet rot that made her stomach drop. 3 men on rope beds. The room was dim, single window letting in dusk light. A potbelly stove squatted cold in the corner. The Mexican man pushed up on one elbow when Clara entered. His face went gray with the effort. He sucked air through his teeth and lay back down fast. Shallow breathing, careful breathing, broken ribs. Definitely. Maybe worse. The young one thrashed under a thin blanket, head turning side to side. Fever sweat soaked his hair dark. His eyes opened, unfocused and bright with fever. He said something that made no sense. Then his eyes rolled back. Clara's hands tightened on her satchel. The old man sat upright on the 3rd bed back against the wall. His left shoulder bulged wrong, swollen huge, the joint lumpy and purple-black under his shirt. He watched Clara with narrow, suspicious eyes. "You the nurse," he rasped. "I am. You any good? You will know soon enough." Clara set her satchel on the nearest trunk. She opened it and arranged the instruments in order. Scissors, forceps, needles, scalpels, carbolic acid, laudanum. The brown bottles caught the lamplight. She went to the young one first. Tommy, Jacob had called him. She peeled back the blanket and unwrapped the dressing on his leg. The wound ran from knee to ankle, jagged and deep. Pus thick as cream filled it. Red streaks climbed from the wound toward his groin. But something else caught her eye. The edges of the cut were too clean, too straight. This did not look like a rock slide injury. It looked like barbed wire. Clara filed this away and said nothing. She poured carbolic acid into the wound. Tommy screamed and arched off the bed. Jacob held him down. The carbolic fizzed in the infected tissue. Clara used forceps to pull away dead flesh, gray and soft, coming apart under the metal. Tommy passed out. Better. She flushed the wound with boiled water 3 times, packed it with gauze soaked in diluted carbolic, wrapped it snug but not tight, elevated his leg on a folded blanket. While she worked, a memory flashed behind her eyes. Helen Morris on the delivery table, blood spreading across white sheets. Clara's own hands frozen, unable to move, unable to think. The surgeon arriving too late, the baby screaming, the mother silent. Clara's fingers trembled on the forceps. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. Forced herself back to the present. Back to Tommy's leg. Back to work. The Mexican man was Miguel. She unwrapped his makeshift binding and found 2 broken ribs, maybe 3. She could feel the displacement under his skin. She bound them proper with clean strips of sheet. When she finished, he could breathe deeper. The old man was Pete. He watched everything with eyes like a hawk. His dislocated shoulder had been out for 6 days. The joint was swollen tight. "This is going to be bad," Clara said. Pete's mouth set in a line. "No laudanum. Save it for the kid." Clara looked at Jacob. "Hold him. Do not let him move." She grasped Pete's wrist and elbow, pulled steady traction. The shoulder resisted. She pulled harder. Pete's face went white. She rotated the arm, felt for the socket, pushed, pulled, rotated again. The joint popped back with a sound like a branch breaking. Pete went limp. His breathing came in gasps. "Do not lift anything for 2 weeks," Clara said. Pete's voice was weak. "I got work to do. Then you will destroy the joint and never lift anything again." He did not argue more. Clara stood. Her hands trembled. The first tremor she had allowed since entering the bunkhouse. 3 men breathing easier than they had in days. She sat on the empty 4th bed and stared at her hands. Blood dried brown under her fingernails. Outside, something howled. Not a dog. Something wild. Jacob stood near the door. "They going to make it?" he asked. "Ask me in 10 days, Clara said. Later, after the lamps burned low and the bunkhouse was quiet, Clara crossed the yard toward the house. The night was cold and the stars were thick enough to touch. Behind the bunkhouse, she stopped, Jacob's voice low and tense, carrying on the still air. He was speaking to someone she could not see. The other voice said, "Briggs wants an answer before the end of the month, Jacob. You do not have another play." Clara stood in the dark and listened to the silence that followed. Then she went inside, lay on the rope bed, and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came. On her 3rd day at the ranch, Clara found the whiskey bottle hidden under Jacob's pillow. On her 5th day, she found the photograph of Sarah and realized the dead woman looked enough like her to make her skin crawl. The days fell into a pattern. Clara checked the men at dawn, unwrapped wounds, cleaned them, rewrapped. Tommy's fever broke on the 2nd morning. He slept real sleep for the first time, his face slack and peaceful, the thrashing gone. When he woke, his eyes were clear. He looked at Clara like she was something he did not quite believe was real. "You saved my leg," Tommy said. "Not yet," Clara told him, "but I am working on it." Miguel breathed deeper each day. The broken ribs were knitting together slow but steady. He told Clara about his children, 3 boys and a girl. The oldest was 8. His wife, Carmen, lived in town with her mother while Miguel worked the ranch. He sent money when he could. "Carmen wants me to quit," Miguel said one afternoon while Clara checked his binding. "She is scared I will die out here. She says the money is not worth my life." "Why do you stay?" Clara asked. Miguel was quiet for a long time. "Because Jacob Cole stood with me when nobody else would. When my family came north from Chihuahua, and every rancher in the territory turned us away, Jacob gave me work and never asked where I came from. When Sarah was dying, I stayed. Worked for promises. Some debts you do not pay with money. Pete was different. He complained about everything. The food, the bed, the binding. Too tight, then too loose. Clara took too long. Clara was too rough. His complaints got louder each day. Clara did not mind. Complaining meant healing. But beneath the crusty surface, something else emerged. Pete had served as a Confederate field medic during the war. He recognized Clara's surgical technique immediately, the way she tied knots, the speed of her stitching. "You trained under someone good," Pete said one morning while Clara changed Tommy's dressing. "My mother," Clara said. "She was a nurse before me. These were her instruments." Pete nodded slowly. "I knew a woman like that in the war. Ran a field hospital outside Richmond. Saved more men than most surgeons I worked under. He paused. I was on the other side, you know. Confederate. Jacob was Union. I know, Clara said. Pete looked at her with something that might have been respect. War is a long time ago, but it is not gone. Jacob and me, we do not talk about it. We just work side by side and let the years do what talking cannot. On the third day, Clara went looking for extra blankets in Jacob's room. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. A larger bed than hers, quilt pulled tight across it. Military corners. A man who kept things in order because order was all he could control. She found the blankets in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. But when she lifted them out, her hand brushed something hard underneath. A bottle. She pulled it out. Whiskey. Good whiskey from the look of the label. The bottle was sealed, unopened. The cork showed no wear, but it sat within arm's reach of where Jacob slept every night. A man fighting himself in the dark, testing his own willpower with the enemy right there on the nightstand. Clara put the bottle back exactly where she found it. She took the blankets and left. 2 days later, she found the photograph. She had gone back for a second blanket because the nights were getting cold, and Tommy was shivering. This time the drawer on the nightstand was slightly open. Inside, a tintype in a brass frame. Sarah Cole. Jacob's dead wife. The resemblance was not exact. Sarah's face was rounder, her eyes lighter, but the dark hair was the same. The angular jaw. The way she looked directly at the camera without smiling, chin up, like she dared the world to disappoint her. Clara stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it back and closed the drawer and stood in Jacob's room with her heart beating too fast and a question she could not answer. Did Jacob Cole pull her off that bench in Prospect because of who she was or because of who she looked like? That afternoon, a woman appeared at the ranch on foot. She came from the east, walking steady, carrying a deerskin bundle under one arm. She was neither young nor old. Her hair hung in 2 thick braids, black streaked with gray. Her face was brown and lined and calm. She wore a cotton dress with a beaded belt and moccasins that made no sound on the packed earth. Jacob met her in the yard. "Ruth," he said, nodding. "Jacob," she said, nodding back. "This is Ruth Whitehawk," Jacob told Clara. "She has been tending to the men since they got hurt. Knows more about healing plants than anyone in the territory." Ruth looked at Clara with dark, steady eyes. "You are the nurse from Philadelphia." "I am," Clara said, and she heard the stiffness in her own voice. The skepticism. Eastern training meeting, frontier herbalism. She was not proud of it, but it was there. Ruth did not seem offended. Did not seem. She simply untied the deerskin bundle and spread it on the porch rail. Dried roots, leaves, bark. Things Clara did not recognize. Ruth pointed to a small jar Clara had been using on Tommy's wound. "You are giving him too much laudanum," Ruth said. "That dose will bind his bowels and slow the healing. Cut it by half. Use willow bark tea for the pain instead." Clara's first instinct was to argue. She had 3 years of hospital training. She had textbooks. She had science. But something in Ruth's voice stopped her. Not arrogance, certainty. The quiet certainty of someone who had watched plants heal people for longer than Clara had been alive. That night, Clara checked her medical text. Ruth was right about the laudanum dose. The realization sat uncomfortable in Clara's chest. She cut Tommy's dose the next morning and brewed willow bark tea the way Ruth had described. Tommy's pain eased, his bowels moved, his color improved. Clara did not thank Ruth directly. She was not ready for that yet, but she started watching the older woman more carefully when she visited. Started listening. The beginning of something she could not yet name. Evening came and Jacob appeared on the porch with 2 tin mugs of coffee. He sat on the rough bench facing west. Clara sat beside him. The mountains turned purple as the sun dropped. Steam rose from the mugs. For a moment, Clara thought this might be peaceful, might be simple. Then she opened her mouth. "I heard you talking to someone behind the bunkhouse my first night here. Who is Briggs and what does he want?" Jacob's whole body went tight. She could see it in his shoulders, his jaw, the way his hand clenched around the tin mug. "That is ranch business," he said, "not yours." Clara set her coffee down. "I am living on your property, treating your men, eating your food. If someone is threatening this place, it concerns me." "It does not concern you," Jacob said. His voice was flat, final. A wall slamming down. Clara recognized that wall. Thomas had built the same kind, always protecting her from information, always deciding what she needed to know, always keeping her outside the room where decisions were made. "Fine," Clara said. She picked up her coffee and went inside. The next morning, Pete caught Clara alone in the bunkhouse while she was changing Tommy's dressing. Tommy was sleeping. Miguel had gone outside to sit in the sun. Pete's voice was quiet, almost gentle, unusual for a man who communicated mostly in profanity and complaints. "I need to tell you something," Pete said. Clara kept working, unwinding the old gauze, inspecting the wound beneath. "You look like her," Pete said. "Not the face so much. It is the way you stand, the way you hold your ground. You ought to know that before you start feeling things for him." Clara's hands went still on the bandage. She did not look up. "I found the photograph," she said. Pete nodded. "Sarah was a good woman, strong, stubborn as a mule in a mud hole. Jacob loved her in that way a man loves something he does not believe he deserves. And when she died, something in him closed up, locked tight. He keeps that whiskey bottle by his bed to prove he can resist it. But what he is really resisting is letting anybody in again." Clara finished Tommy's dressing in silence, tied the gauze off, stood up. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Pete grunted. "Just figured you should know what you're walking into." That night, Clara lay on the rope bed listening to wind push against the window frame. She thought about Sarah's photograph, about Thomas's letter, about the sealed whiskey bottle within arm's reach of Jacob's pillow. She thought about Tommy's leg wound, too clean for falling rock, too straight. In the morning she would ask Tommy the truth, but in the morning Tommy was gone. Tommy had not run off. His bed was soaked through with blood. The sutures on his leg had torn open. A smeared trail led from the bunkhouse to the horse corral and disappeared into open prairie. Clara saw the blood first. She had come to the bunkhouse before dawn, same as every morning, carrying fresh gauze and a kettle of boiled water. The door scraped open, and the copper smell of blood hit her before her eyes adjusted to the dark. Tommy's bed was empty. The thin blanket lay crumpled on the floor, soaked dark. The sheet beneath was worse. A handprint smeared across the bed frame where he had pulled himself upright. The blood trail led across the dirt floor, through the door, and out into the gray pre-dawn. Clara set the kettle down and ran. Jacob was already in the yard, saddling the gelding. He had seen the blood trail from the house. His face was set hard, jaw locked, hands moving fast on the cinch straps. "He took a horse," Jacob said. "The Little Bay. Tracks go north." Clara said, "He is bleeding badly. Those sutures will not hold if he has been riding." They found Tommy half a mile out, slumped against a fence post, where the barbed wire met a corner brace. The Little Bay stood nearby, reins dragging in the dirt. Tommy was conscious, but barely. His face was gray-white. The leg wound had torn open completely, and blood pooled in the dust beneath him, dark and spreading. Clara dropped from the wagon before it stopped moving. She was on her knees beside Tommy in seconds, hands pressing against the wound, gauze from her satchel packed tight against the torn flesh. Tommy groaned. His eyes found hers. "I am sorry," he whispered. His teeth were chattering despite the morning heat. "I had to leave. They will come back. They will finish it." Clara did not ask who. Not yet. She worked. Pressure on the wound. Fresh sutures placed fast with shaking hands while Jacob held Tommy still. The boy screamed once, then bit his lip until blood welled bright against his teeth. They got him back to the bunkhouse. Clara worked for an hour, cleaning the reopened wound, debriding the edges where flesh had torn, resuturing with silk thread and a curved needle. Her back ached. Her eyes burned. But her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady when someone was bleeding. When Tommy was stable, sleeping fitfully with fresh bandages and a half-dose of laudanum, Clara washed her hands in the basin outside. The water turned red, then pink, then clear. She dried them on her skirt and went to find Jacob. He was on the porch, sitting in the chair that was not Sarah's. His hat was off, his head in his hands. Clara sat across from him. Her voice was level, but her eyes were not. Tommy did not get hurt in a rock slide, she said. Jacob did not move. I knew the first night, Clara continued. The wound is too clean, too straight. Barbed wire, not rock. Now he is telling me someone is coming back to finish it. I need to know what happened, Jacob. The truth. All of it. Jacob raised his head. He looked old in the morning light, older than 38. The stubble on his jaw was 3 days thick, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Briggs, he said. Harlan Briggs. He owns the silver mine south of town. He's buying up every ranch and homestead in this valley because he knows the railroad is coming through. The land will be worth 10 times what it is now. He has been squeezing me for 2 years. I owe him money I cannot pay. And your men? Clara said. Briggs's riders cut my fence wire, Jacob said. Deliberately. So my cattle would scatter onto open range, where Briggs's men could claim them as strays. Tommy caught them at it. They cut him with the wire when he tried to stop them. Miguel and Pete came running. Miguel took a boot to the ribs. Pete got thrown into a rock face. That is how his shoulder went out. Clara's voice was very quiet. And you told me it was a rock slide. Jacob met her eyes. Yes. Why? Because I am ashamed, Jacob said. The words came out rough, like they had been stuck behind his teeth for weeks. Ashamed that Briggs is running me off my own land. Ashamed I cannot protect my own crew. Ashamed that when you asked me what happened, I lied because I did not want you to see how bad it really is. Clara stood. The chair scraped against the porch boards. I left a man who lied to me, she said. Rode 2 days on a train straight to another man doing the same thing. Jacob's face flinched like she had struck him. You have been here 2 weeks. Do not pretend you understand what I am holding together. I understand lies, Clara said. I have had plenty of practice. She went inside, pulled her carpet bag from under the rope bed, started folding her spare dress, her nightgown, her stockings. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the old familiar feeling of being shut out, kept in the dark, treated like a child who could not handle truth. She was halfway through packing when the wagon came. The sound carried across the quiet ranch, wheels grinding fast, a horse being driven hard. Clara went to the window. A wagon was barreling up the road, dust rising behind it. A woman driving, someone small in the wagon bed. The wagon skidded to a stop in the yard. The woman jumped down before the wheels stopped turning, 40-some. Sun-weathered, strong arms. Her face was wild with panic. In the wagon bed, a girl maybe 8 years old sat cradling her left hand against her chest. Even from the window, Clara could see the child's face, gray-white, lips pressed together, not crying, shaking. Pulled a pot off the stove, the woman was saying as Clara came out onto the porch. The carpet bag forgotten on the bed. Boiling water all down her hand and arm. I cleaned it, but I did not know what else. Clara said, "Bring her inside. Lay her on the kitchen table." The woman carried the girl in, set her on the scrubbed pine. Mrs. Yates, Clara remembered from somewhere. The girl was Emma. Girl. Emma? Clara said. I need to see your hand. The child held her arm tighter against her chest. It is going to hurt when I look, Clara said. No point lying to children. But then I can make it better. Can you be brave? Emma's chin trembled. She nodded. held out her arm, slow. Clara unwrapped the dish towel Mrs. Yates had wrapped around the burn. The cloth stuck where fluid had dried. Emma gasped, but held still. The burn ran from palm to elbow. Angry red. Blisters forming, some small as pinheads, some large as pennies. But one patch near the wrist had gone white-gray. 3rd degree. The skin cooked through. Clara looked at that white patch and felt the world narrow down to a single point. She had 2 choices. Leave it alone. Safe. Conservative. Let it heal on its own and hope infection did not set in, or debride the dead tissue now. Cut it away. Painful. Aggressive. But the wound would heal cleaner and Emma would keep full use of the hand. Safe or brave. The last time Clara chose safe, Helen Morris died on the delivery table in Philadelphia. Clara opened her satchel. She said, "This is going to hurt, Emma. I am not going to lie to you. But when I am done, your hand will get better. I promise." She cut away the dead tissue with her smallest scalpel. Emma screamed. Mrs. Yates turned away, gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles went white. Jacob appeared and held Emma still, his big hands gentle on the child's shoulders. The dead skin came away in thin strips. Underneath, raw pink tissue. Alive. Clean. Clara coated the entire burn with honey, thick and warm. Old remedy that worked better than most new ones. She wrapped the arm in clean muslin strips and tied it off at the shoulder. "Keep it wrapped," Clara told Mrs. Yates. "Change the dressing twice a day. Cool water, fresh honey, clean cloth. Come back in 3 days so I can check it." Mrs. Yates held her daughter, rocked slightly. "I do not have much," she said. "The doctor in town will not come for folks like us." "Too far," Clara said. "Too poor." "I know." Mrs. Yates went to the wagon and came back with a basket. 2 dozen eggs nested in straw. 3 jars of plum preserves. A cloth sack heavy with dried beans. She set it all on the table. Before leaving, she gripped Clara's hands tight. Her palms were rough with calluses. "There are more like us out here," Mrs. Yates said. "More who need help, if you stayed." The wagon rolled away. Dust settled in its wake. Clara stood in the yard. The sun had set completely. Stars were starting to show. She could see thin smoke columns rising in the distance. Other homesteads. Other families. She went inside. The carpet bag sat on the rope bed, half-packed. Clara looked at it for a long time. Then she unpacked it, folded everything, put it away. She found Jacob on the porch. "I am staying," she said. "Not for you. For them. For the people out there who need help and cannot get it." Jacob nodded. "But you and me," Clara said, and her voice was iron. "You need to be honest with me, completely. If you cannot do that, I am your nurse and nothing more." Jacob looked at her. In the fading light, his eyes were dark and unreadable. "I will try," he said. He meant it. But he did not tell her about the letter Briggs had sent that morning. The letter demanding full repayment or forfeiture of the ranch before first snowfall. He did not tell her because he had not yet noticed that the signature at the bottom was not Harlan Briggs. It was Thomas Whitfield, legal representative. Thomas Whitfield walked into Clara's makeshift treatment room on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a new hat, a new vest, and the same old smile. The one that used to make her believe she was loved. Clara was checking Miguel's ribs when she heard the horse in the yard. Single rider, moving slow. She straightened, one hand pressed to her lower back, and looked through the bunkhouse window. The man who dismounted was lean and well-dressed for prospect. Clean boots, pressed trousers, a gray vest over a white shirt with celluloid collar. He removed his hat and smoothed his hair, a gesture Clara knew as well as her own heartbeat. She had watched him do it 100 times in Philadelphia parlors and restaurant doorways, and the lobby of the Continental Hotel where he had proposed to her over oysters and champagne. "Thomas," she said. The word came out flat. "Dead as a board." Miguel looked at her face and went still. Clara walked outside. Thomas stood in the yard, hat in his hand, studying the ranch with an expression Clara recognized. The expression he wore when calculating the value of something he intended to buy. He looked at the barn, the house, the sagging fence, the bunkhouse. Then he looked at Clara. "Clara," he said. His voice was warm, practiced. "You look well? What are you doing here, Thomas? I am here on business." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded document. "On behalf of my client, Mr. Harlan Briggs. He is interested in acquiring this property. I understand Mr. Cole has been having some financial difficulties." Clara felt the ground shift under her boots. "You work for Briggs." "I represent his interests, yes." Thomas smiled. It was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was patient. The way you smile at a child who does not understand. "You know Jacob owes Briggs money," Clara said. "You know what Briggs has been doing to the ranchers out here. And you are helping him." Thomas tucked the document back into his vest. "I am helping him build something, Clara. The railroad is coming. This valley will be worth more in 5 years than anyone here can imagine. Briggs sees that. The people squatting on this land do not. They are not squatting. They are living here, working here, dying here." Thomas looked at her with something close to pity. "You always did romanticize suffering," he said. The words landed like a blow. Clara felt heat climb her neck. Jacob appeared from the barn. He walked toward Thomas with the careful, measured gait of a man keeping himself in check. He stopped 10 feet away. His hands hung at his sides, but they were not loose. "You, Thomas Whitfield," Jacob said. "I am. I got your letter. The land is not for sale." Thomas mounted his horse, looked down at both of them from the saddle. "Mr. Briggs is a patient man," he said, "but winter is coming. Patience has limits." He turned the horse, then stopped, looked back at Clara. "You ran from Philadelphia because of Helen Morris," Thomas said. His voice carried across the yard. "You think saving strangers out here will undo what happened. It will not, Clara. You will carry that woman's face to your grave no matter how many babies you deliver in dirt floor shacks." He rode away. The hoofbeats faded. Dust settled. Clara stood in the yard and felt her whole body go cold. Jacob was watching her. She could feel his eyes on the side of her face. She did not look at him. She walked to the bunkhouse, checked Tommy's wound, checked Pete's shoulder, checked Miguel's ribs. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. Unwrap, inspect, clean, rewrap. She did not speak, did not pause, did not crack. Jacob recognized what she was doing because it was exactly what he did. Working through pain, burying the hurt under labor. 2 people with the same disease, pretending they did not need the same medicine. That evening they sat on the porch bench. The sky was orange and pink, clouds lit from underneath. Coffee steamed in their mugs. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Clara said, "Helen Morris was 23 years old. First baby. She was hemorrhaging, and I did not recognize how bad it was, not until it was too late. By the time I called the surgeon, she was gone." She paused. "The baby survived. A girl. Helen did not. I was removed from the maternity ward. That is why I accepted Thomas's proposal, not because I loved him, because I needed to run." Jacob was quiet. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. He held it anyway. Then he spoke. "The night Sarah's fever spiked, a blizzard hit. The cattle were dying in the snow. I rode out to save the herd. Took me 6 hours. When I got back, Sarah was past the point where the doctor could help." He paused. 6 hours. That is what I traded my wife's life for. 60 head of cattle in 6 hours I can never get back. Clara waited for him to say it was not her fault, that Helen Morris was not her doing, that she had done her best. That is what people always said. Empty words that changed nothing. Jacob did not say any of that. He said, "Me too." 2 words. And in those 2 words, Clara heard something she had never heard before. Not sympathy, not comfort, recognition. The recognition of one guilty person sitting beside another, both of them carrying the weight of a death they could have prevented, and neither one pretending the weight was light. They sat there until the stars came out. Did not touch. Did not need to. The truth between them was enough for now. But before Jacob went inside, he stopped at the door. Briggs will not stop at buying land, Clara. He will push us out, and I do not know if I am strong enough to hold this place. It was the first time Jacob Cole's voice sounded like a man who was losing. Over the next 6 weeks, Clara saved 13 lives. The 14th nearly killed her. The clinic idea started small. A sketch on the back of wrapping paper from the dry goods store, brown paper with faded flower print on one side. Clara drew while Jacob watched. A rectangle for the barn's back room. An X for where the stove would go, lines for shelves along the walls. Jacob added notes in his cramped handwriting. Lumber, check the barn loft. Hinges, got some in the shed. Stove, borrow from the bunkhouse. Clara made her list on the blank side. Carbolic acid, bandages, forceps, splints, sutures, laudanum, herbs, willow bark and yarrow and comfrey root. They could not pay for most of it. But Jacob sold 6 head of cattle to a buyer in the next valley, a man Briggs had not yet reached, and came back with lumber and nails and whitewash. The neighbors came next. Mrs. Yates and her husband with planking from a shed they had torn down. The Krugers, a widow and her 2 grown daughters, with whitewash and brushes. The Johnsons from the east section with nails and 3 sons who could hammer straight. People Clara had treated. People who had paid in eggs and firewood and dried beans. They came to repay with sweat and muscle and time. The clinic took shape in the barn's back room. Whitewashed walls bright and clean. Shelves built from repurposed barn wood. An examination table donated by Doc Morrison's widow in town. Scarred pine, stained dark in places but sturdy. A curtain on brass rings for privacy. A stove piped into the barn's main chimney. But not everyone was celebrating. Dr. Edmund Holt rode out from town on a Thursday morning. He was a thin man with sharp features and a beard going gray. His horse was good and his clothes were clean, and his hands, Clara noticed, trembled slightly on the reins. He did not dismount. He looked down at Clara from the saddle with eyes that were tired and hard. "You are practicing medicine without a license, Miss Brennan. You are a nurse, not a physician. In Colorado territory, that is against the law." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "I am providing nursing care to people who have no access to a doctor." Holt's mouth tightened. "Because the doctor is too far away, you mean? That is what they all say." "No," Clara said, "because the doctor will not come." The words hung between them. Holt's jaw worked. Something flickered in his eyes. Shame, maybe, or anger at the truth. He rode away without another word. But Clara knew he would be back, and she knew he was right about the law. What she did not know was what was happening in Holt's office that night. The doctor alone at his desk, a suture needle in his trembling fingers, trying to thread silk through the eye. Missing once, twice, 5 times. The thread shaking in his hand. He poured whiskey into a glass, not to drink, but to steady his fingers. It did not work. His hands had been getting worse for months. Some mornings he could barely button his own shirt. Edmund Holt had been a good doctor once, a fine surgeon. He had come west 20 years ago with ideals and a sharp scalpel, and the belief that he could make a difference. Somewhere along the way, the isolation and the whiskey and the grinding poverty of his patients had worn him down. And then Briggs had come along with money, and an easy bargain. Stop riding out to the homesteaders. Let them fail. Let them sell their land. In return, Holt would have a comfortable practice in town, and enough whiskey to keep his hands from shaking. It had seemed like a small compromise at the time. It did not seem small anymore. The patients came, an elderly man with an infected tooth. Clara extracted it with forceps and had him rinse with whiskey. He paid in firewood. A child with scarlet fever, mild but dangerous. Clara isolated her and dosed her with quinine bark tea and monitored her close. a ranch hand with barbed wire cuts. 20 stitches neat and close. He paid in labor and built Clara a medicine cabinet with 12 drawers. Ruth Whitehawk came more often now. She brought dried herbs and roots and showed Clara how to prepare them. Comfrey poultice for swelling, yarrow tea for fever, sage smoke for cleansing wounds. Clara wrote everything down in a leather journal she had bought with money from a grateful patient. The two women worked side by side in cautious respect. Ruth did not push. Clara did not pretend she knew everything. Slowly, the distance between them narrowed. One morning, Ruth said, "Your people and my people do not trust each other. Maybe they never will. But sickness does not care about the color of your skin. A broken bone is a broken bone." Clara looked at her own hands, pale against the dark wood of the examination table. Ruth's hands beside them, brown and scarred and steady, both pairs capable, both pairs healing. "You are right," Clara said, and she meant it in more ways than she could say. The 14th patient came on a Tuesday night in late September. A boy rode in hard on a lathered horse. 16, maybe 17, shaking. "You the nurse," he gasped. "My ma is having her baby. Something is wrong. She has been laboring since yesterday, and the baby will not come, and she is bleeding. Please." Clara was already moving. She grabbed her satchel and called to Jacob. He had the wagon ready in minutes. Ruth Whitehawk was at the ranch that day, helping Clara organize the new supplies. She climbed into the wagon without being asked. The homestead was 2 hours' ride. A sod house with earth walls and a grass roof. One room divided by a blanket on a rope. The woman lay on a narrow bed in the back, sheets soaked dark with blood. Too much blood. Her face was gray and her lips were blue. Clara examined her. The baby was stuck. Shoulder presentation lodged sideways in the birth canal. The cord was wrapped around the neck. No way the baby was coming out on its own. The lamp cast shadows that jumped and flickered. Outside, the boy paced. Jacob stood by the door, silent. Clara worked her hands inside, felt for the baby's position, found an arm, a shoulder. The head turned wrong. She had to reposition it, had to turn the baby while it was still inside, had to do it fast. The Helen Morris flashback hit like a wall of water, sudden, complete, sudden. Clara's hands froze. She could not move them, could not think. Helen's face swam before her eyes, the blood spreading, the silence where a heartbeat should have been. 1 second, 2 seconds. Ruth was beside her. Ruth's hand closed around Clara's wrist, firm, not gentle. "You are not that girl anymore," Ruth said. Her voice was low and sure. "Look at your hands. Look." Clara looked down. Her hands were already working, moving on their own, muscle memory carrying her body through the motions her mind could not manage. The baby turned inch by inch. Clara's arm shook with effort, the head crowned. The mother pushed. The baby came in a rush. A girl, red and wrinkled and not breathing. Clara cleared the baby's mouth, rubbed the small back. No response. She put her mouth over the tiny nose and mouth and breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. The baby gasped, cried, that thin, furious wail of new life. But the mother was bleeding. Badly. Clara delivered the afterbirth, packed the wound with cloth soaked in diluted carbolic, worked through the rest of the night, hands and herbs and everything she had. The bleeding slowed, stopped. The mother would live. But she had lost so much blood that she would be weak for months, maybe longer, maybe always. It was not a clean victory. The baby was perfect and healthy and screaming. The mother was alive but damaged. Clara had saved both their lives, but she had not fixed everything. Could not fix everything. No one could. That was the truth of medicine that no textbook taught you. Sometimes you saved the life, but not the wholeness. Sometimes the best you could do was enough and not enough at the same time. Dawn broke over the prairie. Clara sat outside the sod house, her dress stained with blood and birth fluid, her hands shaking in her lap. Jacob brought her water from the canteen. She drank. It was the best water she had ever tasted. "They are going to be all right?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Because of you, and Ruth, and this." She held up her shaking hands. "These," she said. Jacob sat beside her, not touching, just there. The sun climbed and painted the grass gold, and neither of them spoke. Back at the ranch, the days grew shorter. Autumn settled in. The clinic opened the first week of October. A boy with a broken arm from a mule kick was the first patient. Clara set the fracture clean and splinted it with shaped pine. By the end of the first week, 8 patients had come. The barter system worked. Food, labor, goods for medical care. No money changed hands. Nobody went untreated. One evening, Clara and Jacob sat on their bench. The air had turned cold. Stars pricked through the darkening sky. Something was building between them. Had been building for weeks. In the wildflowers he left by her washstand. In the shirt she mended without being asked. In the way their hands brushed passing tools during the clinic building, and both pulled away like the touch burned. Clara knew what she felt. She was not ready to name it. Not yet. The second patient that morning had been Big Jack McGraw. He walked into the clinic with one eye swollen shut and his cheekbone fractured and blood matting his beard. He stood in the middle of the clean white room and spat red onto the floor. "Briggs sends a message," Jack said. "The clinic closes before Christmas. Or he closes it for you." The storm came from the west in mid-November, but the real storm had started the week before, when Harlan Briggs bought Jacob's debt note from the Prospect Savings Bank. Jacob found out on a Monday. He had ridden to town to buy supplies and stopped at the bank to make a partial payment on his loan. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles, told him the loan had been transferred. "Transferred to whom?" Jacob asked. The clerk would not meet his eyes. "Mr. Briggs, sir. He purchased the note last Thursday. You will need to arrange payment directly with him now." Jacob stood at the counter for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The clerk shuffled papers. Outside, a wagon rattled past. Briggs had bought his debt, which meant Briggs now controlled the terms, the payment schedule, the interest, the deadline, everything. Jacob rode home in silence. He did not tell Clara. He told himself he would figure it out. He would sell cattle, find a buyer Briggs had not gotten to. He would fix this himself. But Briggs had already moved. Over the next week, Jacob rode to every cattle buyer within 3 days' travel. Every single one turned him away. Some were apologetic, some were blunt. "Briggs made it clear," one man said, leaning against his corral fence. "I buy from you, I lose my credit at the bank. I cannot take that risk." Jacob was being strangled, slowly, systematically, and with the precision of a man who had done this many times before. The night before the storm, Jacob sat alone at the kitchen table. Midnight. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning low. Clara was asleep in her room. He could hear the faint creak of her rope bed when she turned. The whiskey bottle sat on the table in front of him. He had taken it from the nightstand drawer, carried it to the kitchen, set it on the scrubbed pine surface. Now he stared at it the way a man stares at an old enemy who has come calling. He turned the cork. Half a rotation. His thumb rested on the seal. He thought about Sarah. Her grave on the ridge, the wooden cross he had carved himself, the letters already wearing soft from rain. He thought about the ranch, everything he had built and was about to lose. He thought about Briggs and Thomas Whitfield and the smug certainty in their voices when they told him to give up. And he thought about Clara, in the next room, the way she hummed a lullaby her mother had taught her when she thought no one was listening. She was humming it now, faint through the wall, A melody he did not recognize, but that felt like something he had been waiting to hear. His hand dropped from the bottle. He did not close it, did not put it away, left it there on the table with the cork half turned. The test continued. He was not done fighting. The sky changed overnight. Clara woke to wrong light through the window. Gray-green, oppressive and heavy. The air pressed down. Even inside the house, her skin felt damp. Jacob was already at the kitchen window. The whiskey bottle was gone from the table, back in the drawer. Clara noticed the ring it had left on the pine surface, but said nothing. "Storm coming," Jacob said. "Big one," Clara said. She could feel it in her bones. The barometric pressure dropping, the animals restless, the chickens pacing in their coop instead of roosting. They worked fast, horses into the barn, chickens into the coop, which took forever because chickens had no survival instinct and ran everywhere except where you wanted them. Tools into the shed, shutters latched. The wind picked up, first gentle, then not. It pulled at Clara's skirt, whipped her hair loose. The first drops fell fat and cold, hitting hard enough to sting. Then more. Then sheets of it, coming sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the valley like something alive and angry. Thunder cracked close enough to feel in the chest. Lightning turned everything white for a heartbeat. Clara could not see the barn, could not see the house, just gray water everywhere. Then the corral gate ripped off its hinges. The sound was enormous. Wood splintering, metal shrieking. 6 horses bolted through the opening and disappeared into the black rain. Their hooves drummed away fast, swallowed by the storm. Jacob ran after them. Clara screamed his name. The wind tore the word away. She could see his silhouette for a second, 2 seconds, moving into the dark, into the rain, into the place where the horses had gone. Then she could not see him at all. He was doing it again. The same thing he had done the night Sarah died. Choosing livestock over the person standing right here, right now, begging him to stay. Clara ran after him, through mud that sucked at her boots, through rain that hit like flung gravel, through lightning that turned the world white and left her blind between flashes. She found him at the broken corral gate, trying to grab a rope, trying to follow the horses into the open prairie where the lightning was striking. She grabbed his arm, yanked him around. He was soaked through, his shirt plastered to his chest, rain streaming down his face. She shouted over the wind, "Do not you die for horses!" Jacob stared at her, and Clara saw the moment his eyes changed. He was not seeing her. He was seeing Sarah. Sarah begging him to stay. Sarah in the fever bed. The same choice, the same mistake. He froze. Clara slapped him, open palm across his jaw, hard enough to snap his head sideways. Rain pouring over both of them. "I am not Sarah," she said. "Look at me, look at me." He looked, and this time he saw Clara. Only Clara, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her calico dress soaked through, her eyes fierce and furious and alive. They ran for the house. Inside, Jacob slammed the door against the wind. They stood in the kitchen, dripping, gasping. The wind rattled the door in its frame. Water found every crack, dripped from the ceiling, pooled on the floor. They set out pots and pans to catch it. The ping of drops against metal filled the silence between thunder. The storm raged for hours. By dawn, it had passed, left behind mud and ruin. Clara stood in the barn doorway, did not go in, could not yet. The clinic section was destroyed, roof half gone, gaping holes showing sky. Water stood ankle-deep on the floor. Shelves sagged or had fallen completely. Bandages floated in brown water, medicine bottles shattered. The examination table had collapsed under the weight of water. The medicine cabinet lay on its side, drawers open, contents spilled. Outside, 3 horses lay dead in the east pasture, lightning strike. The remaining livestock would not cover what Jacob owed Briggs. Clara stepped inside the clinic. Her boots squelched in the water. Cold climbed her leg. She picked up a bandage roll. It came apart in her hands. She dropped it. She knelt in the water, dug through mud and debris, found 3 bent needles, A spool of surgical silk, soaked. Her mother's scalpels in their case. The felt lining ruined, but the blades intact. She held the needles in her palm and stared at them. Everything they had built, gone. She had been so sure, so confident, thought she could make a difference here, that a nurse from Philadelphia could run a frontier clinic from a barn. That barter and good intentions would be enough. Thomas had been right. She was foolish, naive. Her throat closed. She wouldn't cry. But her chest felt crushed, unable to draw a full breath. Jacob found her there, kneeling in the water, covered in mud, holding 3 bent needles like they were gold. He sat beside her on an overturned bucket, the water soaked through his trousers. Neither of them cared. "Sarah died of fever," Jacob said. His voice was quiet. "It took 3 days. I kept thinking she would turn around. By the time I admitted it was serious, by the time I got her on the wagon, she was already dying. I could have gotten her there sooner, could have admitted it sooner. But I was scared and stupid. And by the time I stopped being both, it was too late." Clara's hands lay limp in her lap, muddy and useless. "I could sell this place," Jacob said. "Move to Denver. Get a job working for someone else. Be done with it." He looked at her. But then, what was it for? What was any of it for? Sarah dying, you coming here, building the clinic, all of it just to give up when it gets hard. Clara looked at her hands. Broken nails, mud caked deep. These hands had delivered a baby by lamplight in a sod house, had set bones and stitched wounds and pulled a child's burned skin back from the edge of ruin. These hands had built something and watched it collapse. Could they build again? She stood, her skirts squelched and dripped. "We will need lumber," she said. "Better lumber this time. And a steeper roof pitch so water runs off." Jacob stood too. "I will ride to town tomorrow. Sell some head if I can find a buyer. Get supplies." The yard was churned mud. The barn stood damaged but standing. The house had weathered it. The clinic could be rebuilt, would be rebuilt. Clara looked at the mountains. Still there. Still purple and distant and unconcerned. The storm had passed. The sun was shining. On the second day after the storm, while Clara was digging through rubble for salvageable medicine, a rider appeared from the direction of town. Not Thomas, not Briggs. It was Dr. Edmund Holt, sober, sitting straight in the saddle, hands trembling on the reins but eyes clear. "I heard you lost your clinic," he said without dismounting. "I have got one in town. It is not much, but it has got a roof." Dr. Holt did not come out of kindness. He came because his hands had gotten so bad he could not hold a scalpel, and he needed someone who could hold one for him. Clara rode to town the next morning. Holt's clinic was above the general store, up a narrow staircase that smelled of dust and old tobacco. The office was small. One examination room, a cabinet of medicines, mostly whiskey and laudanum, and a few patent remedies that were more alcohol than medicine. A desk piled with papers, a window that looked out over Main Street. Holt sat behind the desk. His hands rested on the surface, palms down as if he were trying to stop them from shaking by pressing them flat against the wood. It did not work. The tremor was visible even from across the room. "How long?" Clara asked. Holt looked at his hands. "Almost a year since I could thread a suture needle. 6 months since I could hold a scalpel steady. 3 months since I stopped trying." His voice was not self-pitying. It was factual. The voice of a man cataloging the collapse of everything he had built his life around. "I have been prescribing pills and sending people away," Holt said, "telling them there was nothing I could do, telling them to ride to Denver. 3-day journey, most of them cannot afford." He paused. "I told myself it was the distance, the pay, the isolation, but the truth is my hands gave out and I was too proud to admit it." Clara said nothing, waited. Holt continued, "You have the hands. I have the license. Under territorial law, a nurse can practice under a physician's direct supervision. You work out of this clinic under my authority, and everything you do is legal. In return, you are my hands. I tell you what to cut, you cut it. I tell you where to stitch, you stitch it. And the patients, Clara said, all of them, not just the ones who can pay. Holt was quiet for a long time. Through the window, Clara could see the street below. A wagon loaded with mining equipment rolled past. Two women in bonnets crossed toward the mercantile. A boy chased a dog between the buildings. I have been a bad doctor long enough, Holt said finally. His voice cracked on the word doctor. All right. Everyone who walks through that door gets treated. Clara held out her hand. Holt took it. His grip was weak, the fingers trembling against her palm. But his eyes were steady. It started the next day. Clara cleaned the office from top to bottom, scrubbed the floor, washed the windows, organized the medicine cabinet, threw out the patent remedies and replaced them with proper supplies bought with money from the cattle Jacob had managed to sell. Word spread fast in a small territory. Within a week, patients were coming. A miner with a crushed finger, a child with croup, a pregnant woman wanting reassurance that everything was normal. Clara treated them all, Holt supervising from his chair, his voice steady even when his hands were not. Between patients, Holt taught her things the nursing school in Philadelphia had not covered. Surgical techniques, diagnostic patterns, the art of reading symptoms the way a tracker reads hoofprints. He was a good teacher, better than he had been a doctor in years. Clara split her time between the ranch and town, 3 days at the clinic, 4 days at the ranch, treating whoever came to the door. The ride between the two was 2 hours each way. She learned to sleep in the saddle, her body swaying with the horse's gait, waking at every change in rhythm. Her relationship with Jacob during these weeks was strained in ways neither of them could name. He felt her pulling toward town, toward work that did not need him. She felt him withdrawing into silence and pride. The old patterns. They argued one evening on the porch. The air was sharp with the first real cold of autumn. You need help, Clara said. With the ranch, with Briggs. You cannot do this alone. I do not need anyone to save me, Jacob said. His jaw was set. His eyes were hard. Nobody is saving anybody, Clara said. I am talking about sharing the weight. That is what people do when they care about each other. They share the weight. Jacob looked at her. The hardness in his eyes flickered. Something underneath it, something frightened and wanting and unsure, showed through for just a moment before he locked it down again. I have been sharing weight my whole life, he said. Shared it with Sarah until the weight killed her. I will not do that to someone else. Clara felt the words hit, felt the truth in them, felt the wound underneath. She said, Sarah did not die because you shared weight with her. She died because you tried to carry it all yourself. You rode out into that blizzard alone. You made that choice alone. And it is the alone that killed her, Jacob, not the sharing. He did not answer. But his hands, which had been clenched on his knees, slowly opened. The community had not been idle. Mrs. Yates had been talking to every homesteader within 20 miles. Ruth Whitehawk had been talking to the families on the reservation boundary. Miguel's wife, Carmen, had been talking in town. A picture was forming, pieced together from dozens of stories, of what Harlan Briggs had been doing to the valley. The same pattern everywhere. Buy the debt, squeeze the payment schedule, cut off buyers for livestock. Wait until the rancher could not pay. Foreclose. Add the land to Briggs's growing empire. Mrs. Yates showed up at the ranch one Sunday afternoon with a document. She had dictated it to the school teacher, who had the best handwriting in the territory. It was a formal complaint addressed to the territorial judge in Denver, accusing Harlan Briggs of predatory land practices and fraudulent property appraisals. 17 families have signed it, Mrs. Yates said. More will. Ruth Whitehawk stood behind her. Briggs's men drove me off my grazing land 2 years ago, Ruth said. Same method. Bought the debt. Squeezed until I could not breathe. I can testify. Clara looked at Jacob. He was staring at the document in his hands. She could see the muscle working in his jaw, the pride fighting the gratitude. You did this, he said to Clara. They did this, Clara said, nodding at Mrs. Yates and Ruth. I just stitched them up. They did the fighting. That evening, Jacob told Clara everything. The debt, the deadline, Briggs buying the note from the bank, the frozen cattle market, the 30 days he had left. He told her sitting at the kitchen table, his hands flat on the pine surface, his voice steady and low. He did not hedge, did not soften, gave her every ugly fact. When he finished, Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. "We will figure it out," she said. Jacob looked at their hands. His scarred. Hers calloused now, roughened by months of frontier medicine and ranch work. Two hands that had been through separate wars and somehow ended up on the same table. They were washing dishes after dinner when it happened. Clara's back was to the room. She turned to reach for a drying cloth, and Jacob was there. Closer than she expected. Close enough that she could see the small scar on his chin she had never noticed before. Close enough to feel the heat coming off his skin. Neither moved. Water dripped from Clara's hands onto the floor. Jacob kissed her. Short, shaking, not smooth. His lips were rough and his stubble scraped her chin, and his hands stayed at his sides like he did not trust them to touch her. Clara kissed him back. Longer. Her wet hands came up and held the sides of his face. He tasted like coffee and wood smoke. They separated, both breathing hard. Clara said, "Do not stop because of Sarah." Jacob's voice was rough. "I am not stopping because of Sarah. I'm stopping because I am scared." "So am I," Clara said. "But I am tired of being scared." They stood there in the kitchen with dishwater on the floor and lamplight making their shadows huge on the wall. Then Jacob kissed her again. Not short this time. Later, sitting on the porch bench under the stars with fresh coffee in their mugs, Clara leaned her shoulder against his. He did not pull away. The next morning, Clara arrived at the town clinic and found the front window smashed in. Inside, every medicine bottle had been swept off the shelves and shattered on the floor. Glass and liquid everywhere. The smell of carbolic and laudanum and whiskey mixing in a sickly pool. On the whitewashed wall, painted in red, were two words. "Go back east." Below them, in smaller letters, two more words. Words that turned Clara's blood to ice. Helen Morris. Only two people in the world knew about Helen Morris. Clara's father in Philadelphia, and Thomas Whitfield. Clara stood in the destroyed clinic, staring at the name on the wall until Holt arrived. The old doctor looked at the damage, looked at the wall, looked at Clara's face. He did not ask questions. He started sweeping glass. "Thomas wrote to my father," Clara said. Her voice was flat, empty. He got the story, and now he is using it. Holt's broom stopped. "Using it how? To drive me out. If people hear that a patient died because of me, nobody will let me near their families." Holt leaned on the broom handle. His hands shook against the wood. "That is Briggs talking, not Whitfield. Briggs knows you're keeping people on their land. Healthy settlers do not sell." Clara cleaned up the clinic, replaced what she could, spent 3 days preparing, not running. Preparing. On Thursday, she walked into Big Jack McGraw's saloon. The room fell quiet when she entered. Women did not walk into saloons in Prospect. Certainly not women in calico dresses with medical satchels and eyes that could cut glass. Thomas was at a corner table, neat as always. Whiskey in front of him, barely touched. Briggs's man. Briggs's voice. Clara walked to the center of the room. She did not sit down. She looked at Thomas. "Go ahead," she said. "Tell them." Thomas stood slowly. He straightened his vest. He looked around the room at the miners and ranchers and shopkeepers who filled the tables and lined the bar. He spoke with a lawyer's precision. "Clara Brennan was dismissed from Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia," he said. "A patient died under her care. A young mother named Helen Morris. Clara's negligence caused that woman's death." He paused for effect. "You might want to know that before you let her touch your wives and children." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara felt them like needles. She did not deny it. "Helen Morris died because I was slow," Clara said. Her voice carried across the silent room. "I have lived with that every single day since. The baby survived. Helen did not." I was removed from the maternity ward. That is the truth. All of it. She looked around the room, at faces she recognized, faces she had treated. But since I came here, I have delivered 7 babies on this range. I stitched 11 people back together. I pulled Ada Yates's daughter back from a 3rd-degree burn that should have cost her a hand. I set Bobby Johnson's broken arm. I sat with Margaret Kruger through scarlet fever. I rode 2 hours in the dark to deliver a baby that was stuck sideways in the birth canal and would have died, and the mother with it, if I had not been there. She paused. You know me. You know what these hands do. Silence. Then Mrs. Ada Yates stood up from a table near the wall. She saved my Emma, she said. Her voice was steady and fierce. Miguel Reyes stood. She saved my life and the lives of 2 men I work beside. Pete Dawson stood, a former Confederate standing beside a Union man's wife. She set my shoulder when the town doctor would not ride 2 hours to do it. One by one they rose. Not applause, not drama. Just people standing, quietly, firmly. Farmers, ranchers, wives and mothers. People who had been stitched and set and delivered by Clara Brennan's hands. Thomas looked around the room and saw that he had lost. But Briggs had not. A man Clara did not recognize pushed through the saloon doors. Tall, dust on his coat. He walked to Thomas and handed him an envelope. Thomas opened it, read it. His face changed. The debt deadline is passed, Thomas said. His voice was different now, quieter. The ranch is forfeit. Mr. Briggs will take possession tomorrow under territorial statute. The room went still. Jacob was standing near the door. He had come in behind Clara, unwilling to let her face this alone. He looked at Thomas, then at Clara, then at Pete, who had ridden to town with them and was now reaching into his coat pocket. Pete pulled out a sheaf of papers, folded, worn at the creases, covered in cramped handwriting and official stamps. I spent 3 weeks at the Territorial Records Office, Pete said. Turns out I know my way around county paperwork. He looked at Thomas. Your boss bought Jacob's debt note by filing a fraudulent appraisal. He had the land valued at less than a quarter of its worth so he could buy the note cheap. Under territorial statute, that is fraud. It voids the transaction. Thomas's face went pale. The door opened again. Dr. Edmund Holt walked in, sober, steady. His hands trembled, but his spine was straight. Holt looked at Thomas. Then he spoke, and his voice carried to every corner of that saloon. I have signed the medical certificates on every land deal Briggs has made in this valley for 3 years. I know which settlers really died of fever, and I know which ones died because Harlan Briggs paid me to make sure no doctor rode out to help them. The silence that followed was absolute. Holt continued. I have written statements, dates, names, properties, every certificate I signed under false pretenses. I have sent copies to the territorial judge in Denver and to the railroad investors Briggs has been courting. He paused. I have been a coward and a drunk and a disgrace to my profession, but I am done being those things. Thomas stood very still. His hand moved to his hip. Clara saw the revolver there, half hidden by his coat. His fingers touched the grip. The room held its breath. Thomas's hand was shaking. He was a land agent, not a gunfighter, not a killer. His fingers trembled on the revolver the way Holt's trembled on a scalpel. Fear, not purpose. Jacob stepped forward, no weapon, just his hands at his sides and his eyes on Thomas. You are not going to shoot anyone, Thomas, Jacob said. His voice was calm, quiet. The voice of a man who had fought in a real war and knew what violence actually looked like. Put it down. Thomas looked at Clara. Something moved behind his eyes. Not love, not hate. Something like recognition of the road he had traveled and where it had led him. He set the revolver on the table. Tell Briggs, the game is over, Jacob said. Thomas picked up his hat. He looked at Clara one last time. No apology, no explanation, no dramatic farewell. He walked out the door and into the night street, and he did not look back. Some people simply leave. Briggs would receive Holt's statements, would see the complaint from 17 families on the territorial judge's desk, would learn that his railroad investors had been notified of his land practices. He would tear up the debt note because the math no longer favored him. The valley was not worth a prison cell in the territorial penitentiary. On the ride home, Jacob stopped the buckboard in the middle of open prairie. The moon was bright enough to see each other's faces. The grass stretched silver in every direction. The mountains stood black against the stars. "I almost lost everything," Jacob said. Clara took his hand. "Almost," she said, "but you did not." They sat in the moonlight. The horses stamped softly. A coyote sang somewhere to the north. Another answered from the south. Then Jacob said, "Will you marry me, Clara?" Not a question, a statement. Like saying the sun would rise or winter would come. A fact he had been carrying and finally set down between them. Clara looked at him. His scarred arm, his tired eyes, tired, his jaw working the way it did when he was feeling more than he could say. "Yes," she said. Simple and sure. Jacob's hand tightened around hers. They sat in the buckboard while the moon climbed and the coyotes sang and the prairie held its breath around them. Jacob Cole proposed to Clara Brennan on the ridge east of the ranch house, next to the wooden cross where Sarah was buried, because he wanted the first woman he loved to witness him choosing to love again. He had asked in the moonlight on the prairie, but the formal moment came at dawn 3 days later. He woke Clara before sunrise. 2 horses saddled outside. He had been teaching her to ride over the past months. She was not good at it, but she could stay on. They rode to the ridge in silence. The sky lightened as they climbed, gray to pink to gold at the edges. The grass smelled wet with dew. At the top, Sarah's grave waited, a simple wooden cross. The letters Jacob had carved were softening with weather. Wildflowers grew around the base, purple columbine and yellow paintbrush, the same flowers Jacob had been leaving by Clara's washstand for months. He dismounted, helped Clara down. His hand stayed on her waist a second longer than necessary. Jacob removed his hat, turned it in his hands, looked at the grave. "I loved you, Sarah," he said. "I will always love you. But I am alive, and I think you would want me to be alive all the way, not just breathing." He laid fresh wildflowers on the grave. Then he turned to Clara. He did not kneel. Jacob Cole would not. He stood straight with his hat in his hands, and the dawn breaking gold behind him, and he said, "I want to wake up next to you every morning until I do not wake up anymore. Will you have me?" "Yes," Clara said. The word came out easy and sure, like breathing. The wedding was 3 weeks later when the circuit preacher came through on his monthly rounds. An older man with a Bible worn soft at the edges. They held it in the clinic. "Where else?" Clara said when Jacob asked. The room was full. Miguel and Carmen with their 4 children. Tommy holding hands with Lily, the homesteader's daughter he had been courting. Pete, scrubbed almost beyond recognition, his hair slicked back and his good arm stiff at his side. Mrs. Yates and her family. Emma with her scarred hand, the fingers working fine, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. The Krugers, the Johnsons, the Martinez family. Ruth Whitehawk stood in the doorway at the back. She would not come fully inside. But she was there, bearing witness. Dr. Holt stood beside Clara, not a bridesmaid. The man who had given her a roof and a license when she had neither. Clara wore white muslin, simple, nothing fancy. Mrs. Yates had helped her sew it by lamplight. Her mother's jet brooch at the throat, the only thing she had kept from Philadelphia besides her instruments. Jacob wore a borrowed suit, too tight in the shoulders. Tommy had helped him with the collar and tie. He looked uncomfortable and dear and like himself. The preacher opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." Clara barely heard the words. She was too aware of Jacob's hand holding hers, too aware of every person in that room. People she had stitched and set and delivered and sat with through fever and fear and long dark nights. Do you, Jacob Cole, take this woman? I do. Rough and sure. Do you, Clara Margaret Brennan, take this man? I do. Steady and clear. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride. Jacob's kiss was brief. His hand at the small of her back said everything the kiss did not. Someone produced a fiddle. The examination table got pushed aside. People danced on the whitewashed floor Clara had painted herself. Outside, under the cottonwood trees, a celebration. Someone had baked a cake with boiled icing. Children ran wild between the buildings. Jacob raised a glass of whiskey, not drinking it, holding it up. To Sarah, he said, who dreamed this place, and to Clara, who made it real. His voice caught but held. The room was quiet. Then everyone drank. Mrs. Yates gave Clara a quilt. She unfolded it on the examination table, pieced from fabric scraps. A square of Emma's dress from the day she came in with the burn. A patch from Tommy's shirt from his first days injured. Cloth from the sheets that had bound Miguel's ribs. A piece of Pete's old bandana. Fabric from a dozen families Clara had helped. So you remember, Ada said, as if Clara could forget. The sun set, people left gradually. Families with children to put to bed, ranchers with early morning work. The fiddle player packed up. The cake was reduced to crumbs. Spring came to the valley like a promise kept. The ranch clinic had been rebuilt for the second time, stronger than before. Steeper roof, better lumber. The town clinic still ran under Holt's supervision. Clara rode between the two, 3 days in town, 4 at the ranch. Ruth Whitehawk came every Thursday now. She taught Clara plant medicine, and Clara wrote everything down in her leather journal. Ruth taught her which roots reduced fever, and which bark eased pain, and which leaves, chewed and applied to a wound, drew out infection better than any carbolic acid. Pete's shoulder had healed. He complained about the stiffness every morning and worked through it every afternoon. Miguel had brought Carmen and the children out to the ranch for Sunday dinners. The table was extended with planks across sawhorses. 8 people around it, sometimes 12 when neighbors came. Tommy married Lily in June. Clara delivered their first child the following spring, a boy with his mother's eyes. Briggs had retreated. Not vanished. Men like Harlan Briggs did not vanish. But the territorial judge had his complaint on file. The railroad investors had received Holt's statements. The land grab had stalled. The valley held. Thomas Whitfield was gone. Last anyone heard, he had taken a stage to California. Clara did not think about him anymore. Not with anger. Not with forgiveness. He had simply become irrelevant. A man who had walked out of a saloon and out of her life and left no hole behind. Holt's hands still trembled. They always would. But he stood straighter now, laughed sometimes, which surprised everyone who knew him. He was teaching Clara things no nursing school could offer, and in return, she was his steady hands. The partnership held. One morning in early June, nearly a year since Clara had stepped off the train in Prospect with 38 cents and a broken engagement, she woke to gray light and Jacob already up, standing at the window in his union suit, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and rose. Clara joined him, wrapped in Mrs. Yates's quilt, every patch a memory. Jacob's arm came around her, pulled her close. They looked out at the ranch, the clinic visible from here, white walls catching first light, the barn standing solid, the bunkhouse with smoke curling from its chimney, the garden green and growing, the chickens fussing in their coop. A wagon appeared in the distance, coming fast, someone hurt or scared, always someone. Clara reached for her medical satchel hanging on the bedpost. Then she paused. Her hand moved to her stomach. 3 weeks late now. Not certain, but maybe. She had not told Jacob yet. Was not sure there was anything to tell. But the maybe sat warm inside her, a small, bright coal of possibility. "Someone needs you," Jacob said from the doorway. Clara grabbed the satchel, kissed him quick. His beard scraped gentle against her chin. She ran across the yard toward the wagon. Her boots kicked up dust. The morning sun was warm on her shoulders. Behind her, Jacob stood in the window, watching, always there. The man in the wagon was a homesteader from the west section. His wife in labor, third baby. Should be straightforward, but you never knew. Clara climbed up onto the wagon seat. The man whipped the reins. They rolled out fast, wheels cutting through the morning grass. Clara Brennan Cole ran toward the sound of someone calling for help, her mother's surgical bag banging against her hip, the sun just clearing the mountains and laying gold across the whole valley. Behind her, home, and the man she had not planned on, and the life she had found when the life she had planned fell apart. Ahead of her, someone hurting, someone frightened, someone who needed steady hands and a full heart. She held the satchel tight against her side and watched the prairie unfold before her, endless gold grass bending in the morning wind. The mountains stood purple and eternal on every side. The sky stretched wide enough to hold everything she had lost and everything she had found and everything that was still to come. She did not look back. There was no need. Everything she loved was right here, in these rough buildings and this hard land, and these people who paid in eggs and firewood and smoked ham, in the scarred hands of a cowboy who had watched her turn down 3 jobs and asked the only question that mattered. "What kind of work are you looking for?" She had found it. Found her work. Found her place. Found her home. The wagon rolled north. The sun climbed. The valley held its breath and then, slowly, let it go.